It is argued to be the most popular Star Trek role-playing game of all the ones ever made. It is the popular choice, but is it the logical choice? Let's find out. What's up, Internet? This is Jay with Nerd Rage Against the Machine, and today we're going to review the next Star Trek role-playing game. We've already reviewed the original one from Heritage Models. This was the next one to get released, which is FASA's Star Trek the role-playing game. Now, part of me really dreaded doing this one because it has a lot of fans, and this is one of those videos that I expect to have a lot more hate than most, because if I don't agree, you know, you're going to get backlash. This RPG was the most popular, mostly I think because of Zeitgeist. And while I don't think it's a terrible game, it's a very solid game. I don't think it's as great as people remember per se, mostly because, you know, the rose-colored glasses of nostalgia are firmly on when looking at a product like this. FASA's role-playing game was definitely more well-produced than Heritage. For one thing, they had a lot more money, a lot more coffers. These were the guys who made BattleTech, and they'd made other games. They had cut their teeth working on Traveler. So by the time they do this, they did it right, if you will. They did a lot of production, a lot of material. And they did a good job with the actual production. The starter set, as you see there, comes with these 3 books, which are the Game Operations Manual, which is the GM's Guide, the Starfleet Officer's Manual, which is your player's guide, and then the Cadet's Orientation Sourcebook, which really goes through all the basics of Star Trek lore, so that you have a good foundation. And the cool thing about doing it in a box set like this, where you can separate these books, is that idea that you can, you know, give players only the material they need. If you had a player who was, say, not very versed in Star Trek, hey, why don't you borrow this for the weekend, give it a read, it's not too long, and at least give you, get you up to speed of the difference between fighting as a barbarian dwarf and fighting as a Starfleet Andorian security officer. This was a good idea, don't get me wrong, and the system itself is very solid. It is a percentile-based system using action points for turn-based combat, very tactically minded, even to the fact that they would produce blueprints, like the set of Klingon D7 blueprints in 15mm. These were meant so that you would have deck plans to do full-on dungeon raids, if you will, into a starship. They also made a line of 25mm miniatures, which have very small bases and actually do fit in the squares of this. Plus, there are, of course, counters in the box if you don't want to go that route. The Deluxe Edition, which is what you've got here, also came with the Star Trek Starship Combat Simulator. Again, this is FASA. They were known for Starship combat, or specifically, you know, big combat like BattleTech. This game feels very much like a very BattleTech-y Star Trek combat game. It is a hex and counter game. They also made a full wide range of miniatures for it, which were astounding. And more than Starship combat rules, they would make a literal ton of material. And considering this game came out in 1982 during the Wrath of Khan and would last really up till about 1988 when Star Trek The Next Generation appeared, they did a lot of their own material. There's a lot of very cool stuff in here, a lot of weird stuff, but they really did everything they could to expand this game from just a basic box. There were other campaign concepts like Traitor Captains and Merchant Princes, or the Starfleet Intelligence Manual, which gave you, you know, both private sector, Han Solo, outrageous Okuna style stuff, and, you know, spies in Starfleet kind of things, which were really cool for their day. They also had this really cool concept with these supplements. They did the Romulans, the Klingons, the Orions, all in a very similar way, which was, again, to separate this material into 2 books, one for the players and one for the GM. And what this did was it gave the players information that may be contradicted in the GM's book. so that players might erroneously think this about Klingons, but the GM would know the truth and be able to work with that, which was a really kind of a cool thing. They also did this in their Doctor Who line as well. The line itself, like I said, was prolific. They made a lot of stuff, and one of the weird things about Star Trek versus other genres, I think I've mentioned this before, is the fact that as the media goes, and they're not the ones solely making it, like say Dungeons and Dragons, where they can control the narrative, things get out of hand when it comes to looking back at this stuff. There's a lot of material that is anachronistic or just flat out wrong by today's standards. Some of it's easy to merge and to say, well, like for example, the Klingon homeworld is consistently referred to as Klinzai, like the John M. Ford novels, but we all know it's Kronos now. And that's easy enough to say, well, maybe it's a dialect thing. Some dialects it's Klinzai, some dialects it's Kronos, or maybe even Kuzak, who knows. That works, but there are other things that are a little more silly, such as the Klingon fusion races, where the reason that we had flat-skulled Klingons in the classic show was that they were actually fused with humans so that they would face their foes. There are also examples of Romulan fusions, and that thankfully has kind of been ignored by Star Trek canon. So again, to make this material though, yeah, they would have had to have come up with some of their own stuff, and it's not all winners, but it is pretty decent. The line had also a ton of miniatures. I mean, we had Starship miniatures out the wazoo, and honestly, some of those designs never came back into it. Again, that same idea of Paramount not going, nah, we don't need that, we don't care. So there's a lot of unique designs that were unique to this game, and that Starship Combat Simulator was something you could do without the role-playing game. You could literally just set up a fight and go full-on BattleTech or Warhammer with a fleet of starships, which again is something cool and something you don't see in later iterations of Star Trek. The Last Unicorn, Decipher, and Modiphius versions don't really do a separate Starship combat system. There are, of course, other ways to do that, but not something that's fully integrated like this was. Saying that, in 1988, they did kill the line finally. FASA's official story was that they had decided not to renew the license because of the success of BattleTech and Shadowrun, which were far more profitable to them than having to pay for a license for Star Trek. I've also heard rumors that it was because they wanted to go more militaristic, and Roddenberry and Paramount were not happy with that decision, so there were some sticking points in that renewal of contract, most likely. Either way, all good things come to an end, right? And again, going back to that idea of how things changed, they did make a couple of materials for the next generation, specifically the Star Trek First Year Sourcebook and the Operations Manual, or Officer's Manual. These two were some of the last two products they made, and they were the only products that this line would have that would be in the next generation. The problem is that they are also only based off of the first season. So there is a lot of material, but it's also all based on that first season of TNG, which thankfully, the show evolved in 6 more years. So there's no material on Cardassians, nothing on the Borg, but plenty on the old school Ferengi. You clothe your women! Ooh, yeehaw! Those guys are in here in spades. There's also a full write-up on the Antikin and the Soleil. Who are the Antikin and the Soleil, you may ask? They were in 1 episode, but again, they didn't have much to work with when it came to TNG. And they did put out a pretty beefy amount of material on it even so, and there are unique ships that are in here that don't appear in actual TNG canon because of that. All in all, it is a solid game, and I don't want to get the impression that it's a terrible title or anything like that. When I said that it's not my favorite, it is mechanically a very solid but a very complex game. Using percentiles, there are easier ways to do it. Most people would find easier, and again, I think it's easy for some players. Well, you're just not smart enough to understand the complexity. It's not that. It's also you have to be able to have that with your players. They have to enjoy it, and they may not enjoy a percentile system. There's a reason you don't see a lot of those anymore, unfortunately. But this game works, but it's not perfect by any stretch. And to that end, like I said, it's a solid game, but I wouldn't call it the best Star Trek iteration, in my opinion. But again, everyone's entitled to theirs as well, you know, and you know, if you like it and you think it's the best, hey, more power to you, man. And I hope you enjoy it. But for me, honestly, it's a great source material, and there's a lot of good stuff here. There's also some bad and some kind of laughable stuff as well. And with that, all I can say is live long and prosper, and happy gaming.